The time has finally come and Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade has dropped on the Steam Store and is Steam Deck verified. Prior to this, Final Fantasy VII was only playable on the Steam Deck via the Epic Store, and the easiest way to get that version set up was via the Heroic Launcher. Needless to say, it's always nicer when a game hits Steam and we need to jump through less hoops to play on the Steam Deck. For this game, I investigated a couple different things. Micro SD versus internal SSD, and also the graphics settings, which actually make a big difference. So first here, I'm going to cover the high settings on the micro SD, and then later on in the video, I'll move over to the low settings, which will actually run the game a lot better on the internal SSD. So stick around and check it out. For this video, I'll be running the game at 720p with high settings. Unfortunately, just like the Epic version, there isn't a ton of graphics customization options here. I was holding out hope that they might update the PC version to make it even better when it hit the Steam Store, and then also update the Epic one, but that didn't happen. From what I understand, Final Fantasy VII Remake has a dynamic resolution that will adjust to hit the target frame rate you see here in the settings. This probably uses the built-in Unreal Engine TA upscaling, which does a pretty good job overall here. Because of this, there's not really a reason to use the FSR that's built into the Steam Deck to try to get better frame rates here. As I mentioned in the beginning, the first version we're checking out is installed to the micro SD card, and I'm running the game at 60 FPS here. Well, that's the target at least, but you can see that we're definitely falling short of that right away. And unfortunately, we see some pretty bad spikes right off the bat. Now, this might be due to real-time shader compilation, so that might even out throughout your playthrough, but from what I understood, FF7 Remake had those frame time spikes kind of evened out on the PC version. At launch, I heard it was really bad, so I didn't even pick the game up, but I do actually have the Epic version store of this game also, and on that version, I played it a couple months ago, like maybe one or two, and it honestly seemed better, and the reason I checked it out was I heard that the frame rate time spikes had been mostly evened out, but also I heard that was mostly when you're walking around Midgar that was happening, and because of that, I thought it might be a streaming issue instead of a shader compilation issue. Regardless, I will test the game out further in this video, install to the internal SSD to see if these frame time spikes still occur like this. This game is very visually impressive, so it is pretty cool that in little areas like this, we can touch around 60 frames per second, but honestly, I would probably lock this game to 30 frames per second, and when I do that later on, it hits that a lot more consistently. Now, a bummer about this is obviously with the Steam Deck, you can lock it down to 40 FPS, but if you do that with the Steam settings, your game's still going to target 60 FPS because that's the only other target you can set between, 30 and 60. There's no 40 you can set in the game. So your game's going to be really lowering the resolution of the game trying to hit 60 FPS, but then you'll be limiting it to 40 FPS, so that doesn't seem ideal to me. Gameplay-wise, this game's super fun. It's definitely way faster than the original because the original is all turn-based, and this is action-based, but it actually does have some turn-based mechanics where you build up a meter, you can pause time, and use certain moves. I would definitely prefer to do this at a higher frame rate, but I honestly don't think 30 FPS is too bad for a game that looks this good on the Steam Deck. Now I'm going to go ahead and lock the game down to 30 FPS in the settings menu here, still on the micro SD card for now. We'll definitely hit 30 FPS a lot more consistently, but there are still some frame time spikes here and there, and it can get pretty jittery at times. Now, one thing you'll be doing a lot in this game is watching in-game cutscenes, dialogue, some action, things like that. They're all beautifully shot and super cinematic. I'm fairly certain that the character models here are higher quality than when you're actually in combat in the game, but if you look at the frame time graph right now, we are sitting at a very stable 30 frames per second, so during sequences like this, you can generally expect things to be pretty consistent from what I've seen in the game so far.
This is a one-time gig. When it's done, we're done. Real joy to work with.
Real joy to look at, too.
Now, if you look at Cloud's hair here, it looks pretty fuzzy. I think this has to do with the lower internal resolution that we're rendering at, combined with the TAA, can make all those fine hair strands look pretty fuzzy with a hairdo like Cloud's. Other people, like Wedge here, his hair is, pretty simple and straight down, so it doesn't look as fuzzy as you might see over there. I'll go ahead and jump forward a bit so we can check out some more action gameplay at 30 FPS while we're on the micro SD card still. So after further testing, honestly the micro SD card versus internal SSD doesn't make the biggest difference, and in this gameplay footage here, it looks pretty good, but we get some pretty bad frame time stutters like right there, and we're actually gonna get like full-on freezes pretty soon here too. And after further thinking, dropping the settings actually makes a massive difference, which we'll cut to very shortly also. But if you can see here, our VRAM allocation is about 6.5 gigabytes, and our RAM allocation is about 9.2 gigabytes. From what I understand, the Steam Deck has 16 gigabytes of RAM, and that's shared between the GPU and CPU, so they can access both. So if you add these numbers up, we're getting pretty close to actually hitting our maximum amount of RAM. Because of this, I really think that's causing the frame time issues we see here. If you look at our GPU usage, it's high, but we're not touching 100%. The highest I really see it getting is 92%. So I don't think that we're necessarily hitting a GPU bottleneck in the sense of usage. It's more of a RAM problem that's causing those frame time spikes. But we'll go ahead and jump to the low settings now, and you guys can see the difference there with the frame time graph. Okay, so here I do have the game installed to the internal SSD now, but from the testing I did, even there it was still having frame time spikes, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty sure that's because of our RAM usage. As you can see, just from lowering both those settings from high to low, our VRAM usage has dropped significantly, and our frame time graph is going to look like this for the majority of the time. Little tiny spikes here and there, but I think that is mostly from Unreal Engine loading in the next assets for the next room you walk into. But overall, even in combat scenes, running around, things are way more stable here. And as I said earlier, this is probably the RAM problem that was causing it. So I went ahead and jumped us forward into a action sequence here now that we're fighting a mini-boss. Our GPU usage is still pretty high, but our frame time graph is a lot better. The worst you're going to see is little stutters here and there when really effects heavy sequences pop on screen, like right here. But this little menu pops up, so it might be related to that. Other than that, it's pretty good. Even later on when I'm fighting the boss for the intro part of this game, it's very stable, and we'll jump over to 60 FPS pretty soon, and the game's actually going to do a pretty damn good job of locking 60 FPS. That being said, I do notice that the resolution takes a pretty big hit when we jump over to that resolution. Here, it looks pretty sharp in my opinion, and on the handheld it looks very good. But even on the 60 FPS side, where it's really pretty soft looking on the YouTube capture here, on the Steam Deck screen itself, it doesn't look too bad. Before we jump over there, there's one other thing I wanted to mention. Right there was a stutter. That's probably from loading, like I mentioned before too. But we have the Steam Deck running off battery now, and as you can see, we're hovering around 3 hours of battery left here with a 89% charge. So that's pretty good for 30 FPS with a game that looks this visually impressive.
That's our target, the reactor core. Gotta set the bomb at the bottom. Let's get down there.
Scared, huh?
Alright, now we're going to go ahead and jump up to 60 FPS. Really keep an eye on the sharpness of the game here and how it's quite a bit blurrier than it was before. And that's just the game dropping the internal resolution and then using that upscaling to try to keep up with that 60 FPS cap. As you notice here, our battery life is rapidly dropping. The Steam Deck is trying to adjust to the calculation for all the CPU power that it's going to have to use and some more GPU power to be able to hit these numbers. I went ahead and jumped us to the big boss of the beginning of this game, and this is probably the most visually demanding part of this whole section of the game before you get into the bigger city. I didn't play far enough in advance to see how the performance does there, but I'm guessing that it can't be too much more demanding than a big boss fight like this with effects just popping off constantly. And honestly, we're hitting 60 FPS really well here. There are some things like that when there's a big effect on the screen where we do drop the frame rate, but it feels really nice on the handheld. And if you notice, our battery life has stabilized here to about an hour and a half, so we have about cut our battery in half from what we were at earlier with, pretty similar battery percentage to what we had then. So if you want to play this way, just know that you're not going to be able to play it for very long, but it actually runs really good, and our frame time graph is pretty damn stable here too. So to wrap everything up, I would recommend playing around with the shadow quality and the texture quality to see if you can maybe turn one of them up to high and keep your VRAM usage under that threshold where the game will start stuttering a ton. I think the textures are probably more desirable to have on high, but that's probably also more demanding VRAM wise. Even on low, this game looks really good for the Steam Deck, and getting 3 hours of battery life at 30 FPS for a game like this is pretty crazy. Overall, from my experience with FF7 Remake Intergrade on the Steam Deck, I definitely recommend you check it out if you want to play this game on a handheld. Now, if you want to play another legendary RPG like Skyrim and see how to mod it the best way on the Steam Deck, I have a video coming out very soon covering an in-depth method of modding the game entirely on the Steam Deck, and I also have a bunch of other guides just like this one coming out soon. So subscribe and like this video. Have a good day.
There! Attack it from the rear!
Aye, soldier boy. Show me what you got. Ain't you supposed to be a professional? We still got a job to do. You think I care about a few cuts and bruises? Cause I don't.
All the times